And hello everyone, welcome back to a new video. So today I'll be talking to you about languages that you can learn and why you should and should not. We'll be covering HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, Java, BrainFuck, C++, Delphi, MySQL, Batch, and Bash in that order. We'll be going through what you can do with the language if you decide to learn it and what advantages and disadvantages there are to using it. Now let's get started. Also, just take note that all of this comes from my own opinions and experiences. HTML. HTML, also known as Hypertext Markup Language, is basically what you use to create web pages. Take my website for example. It was made using HTML. Now for the advantages of using HTML. Firstly, it is an easy to learn language. It is great for beginners to programming, in the sense that you learn it quickly and it helps you to understand a bit more on how the web works. It is tag based. You may have heard of people saying that HTML is not a programming language. Well, that is because it is not. As the name suggests, it is a markup language. This is beneficial because if you are a beginner, then HTML is super friendly to you. If you make a mistake in the syntax, then it will most likely not affect the website in any major way. There is always a con for every pro, so let's get to the disadvantages. Just knowing HTML will do you no good. Unlike Java or C++, HTML is just the beginning of what you'll need to know to make a living out of it. We'll get more on that later. HTML is not a programming language, which means that moving from knowing HTML to learning Java is basically like learning Java without knowing HTML. In short, you'll still die trying since HTML is a markup language and not a programming language. CSS. Now for CSS. CSS, in other words cascading style sheets, is what you use to design websites after you used HTML to create them. Some advantages of knowing CSS is you get to learn a ton of stuff digital designers would learn of, such as hexadecimal colors, RGB coloring, layout, opacity, and all that fun stuff. If you only know HTML and CSS, you already stand a chance of getting a job, believe it or not. CSS is beginner friendly, just like HTML. Then we have some disadvantages. As I said, HTML and CSS goes hand in hand. And because of that, learning CSS without knowing HTML is basically like learning how to write Japanese, but not knowing how to read or speak it. CSS is not a programming language. And because of that, it will not help you if you decide to start learning a real programming language, such as Java, JavaScript, or C++. We finally get to our first programming language, JavaScript. Often abbreviated as JS, is a scripting language used when working with web pages. JS has a lot of cool advantages. It is beginner friendly. While the advanced stuff can be quite difficult to grasp, beginning with JavaScript is quite easy and will help you in the future when you try to learn other programming languages. JavaScript has a lot of libraries. What are libraries, you ask? Libraries are just something you can use to make programming easier. Take jQuery, for example. Using vanilla JavaScript to work with HTML tags can be a nightmare, especially for beginners. But when using jQuery, it makes working with tags not only faster, but much easier as well. Knowing JavaScript can score you a well-paying job. You can make games using JavaScript. Whilst not the best or the easiest way to make games, it is still entirely possible whether it is 2D or 3D. It has a massive support group. If you try to search anything up JavaScript related, chances are that you'll find the answer without any trouble. With a lot of ups comes a lot of downs. Let's take a look at the disadvantages. Whilst it is possible to learn JavaScript without knowing HTML or CSS, you'll never be able to use it to its full potential without it. As I said, JavaScript has a lot of libraries, and I wasn't exaggerating. A lot of beginners in JavaScript programming often ask what library should they learn? Vue, Node.js, jQuery, React? This can be quite a difficult question to answer, since each library has its own thing it helps with, but will in the end probably die out. As I said, the libraries die out. A good example can be jQuery. Whilst it is a great library and also very easy to learn, it'll often get called out as a bad library and that you shouldn't learn it anymore. This is because with every new library that comes out, every other library faces the threat of being replaced with something better, stronger, and faster. Learning JavaScript without learning any libraries is not a death wish, but it is almost like learning how to read and write Japanese, but not speak it. Whilst it is acceptable, it is almost like being incomplete. Once a web page gets refreshed, JavaScript does too, which means any data that you were working with will most likely get lost. PHP. Finally, we get to PHP, or also known as Hypertext Preprocessor. It is basically like HTML and JavaScript had a baby. Let me explain. Advantages of PHP. It can manipulate HTML with ease. It can be used to create dynamic web pages, which in simple terms just means that web pages change depending on the context. Take Google or YouTube for example. Each time you search something up, you get new results. And if you wait long enough between the searches, searching the same term twice may give you different results. It is extremely powerful in terms of everything you can do with it. It can turn something you had to do manually, such as update what gets displayed to someone when they search up a keyword, into an automatic process by just adding a few lines of code. It can communicate with databases and servers. It can store user data by using cookies. If the web page is refreshed, you do not necessarily lose all your data like JavaScript. It is more secure than JavaScript and HTML alone. You cannot just see what's going on behind the hood like with JavaScript. Disadvantages. PHP is not too beginner friendly. The initial setup alone is enough to scare some beginners away. Whilst not necessary to know HTML to use PHP, just like with JavaScript, you won't be able to use it to its full potential. Like being able to talk Japanese, but not understanding a single word. Almost pointless. PHP is hated by a lot of programmers, not just because of its quite sad origin story, but because a lot see it as just an incomplete and awful language to code in. Java, often described as the beginner programmer's biggest mistake, is a language used to develop apps and games for all platforms. Here are some advantages. Java is a write once, run anywhere type of programming language, which means that if you try and write it on Windows, then your code should work perfectly fine on any other operating system, whether it is Linux, Mac, or Android. Java is object-oriented, which means it makes programming in it easier because you can think of everything as an object and give it its own file and code. By knowing Java alone, you already have a pretty good chance, but not amazing chance, of getting a job. You can use Java to develop apps and games. If you know Java, learning any other programming language will be a piece of cake. While Java brings some really good benefits to the table, it has quite the dark side. Java is not a beginner-friendly programming language. A lot of beginners, including myself, chose Java to be their first or one of their first programming languages, and most of them failed horribly trying to learn it. Whilst Java can run anywhere, it comes with a small price. It is slow, not as slow that you'll instantly notice it, but slow enough that making big games such as Skyrim with it will show the performance in face value. Think of how Skyrim runs like crap on your 4GB RAM PC now. Try writing it in Java, and we'll hope that an 8GB RAM PC would still be able to run it. BrainFuck. BrainFuck is a trolling programming language. It was made for fun and has minimal benefits that come with learning it. But let's break it down anyways. Advantages. If you learn BrainFuck, then you'll most likely get a good grasp on ASCII values, such as 32 is a space and 65 being a lowercase letter a. By learning BrainFuck, you can impress your friends and family by showing them how smart you are. If you know BrainFuck, little people will question how good you are in programming. You can have a lot of fun coding with it. Disadvantages. It is almost a useless skill to have. Programming even the simplest application can be a really difficult task. You can't run BrainFuck code without a compiler, which means your code has to be open source, which is not necessarily a bad thing, and the person who tries to run it needs a compiler. C++. One of the most popular programming languages in the world is called C++. C++ in a way is an object-oriented version of C. Advantages of learning C++. It is object-oriented, just like Java, thus of course making it easier to code big programs with it. It is a great programming language to use if you want to make games. It is very powerful since it talks directly to your machine to execute code. Disadvantages of using C++. Because it can talk directly to your machine, unlike Java, it can't run anywhere. Something you write in Windows is not guaranteed to run in Linux or Mac, and vice versa. Whilst it is easier to learn than Java, it is not beginner friendly and is recommended to know at least one other programming language before starting with C++. Delphi, or Object-Oriented Pascal, is one of the most learned programming languages by beginners. It may not be as popular as C++, Java, or JavaScript. It certainly needs to be called out. Advantages. It is beginner friendly. This is mostly thanks to the language being very close to pseudocode, code that is written in everyday human-readable format. It comes with an IDE that gives you a form to create applications with. Newer versions of Delphi allow you to create apps for Android, Mac, Windows, and Linux. It is free. Whilst you have to pay to be allowed to deploy any applications you make with it legally, just using the IDE to learn or build apps for yourself is free. Delphi provides a super easy way to work with databases and can use SQL or its own code to manipulate them. Disadvantages. Delphi has a very small support group, so searching for answers most likely leads to dead ends or only more confusion. Knowing Delphi won't just score you a job as a developer. The language has died out and is now mostly used to teach beginners how to code. Delphi is a slow language. This means making 2D or 3D games is almost not an option. Also, doing hardcore processing in the background has a higher chance of crashing your PC, more than other more popular programming languages, that is. You have to pay to use some of its features and deploy projects. You can't code using the latest Delphi on non-Windows operating systems. MySQL. SQL, or more specifically in this case MySQL, also pronounced as MySQL, stands for Structured Query Language. It is a language used to communicate and manipulate databases. SQL has a lot of advantages that comes with it. Here are a few. It is very beginner friendly. It is a lot like Delphi in terms of you can code how you say it, or pseudocode. It can be used with a lot of programming languages, such as Delphi and PHP. It can score you a job in database administration. Of course, there are disadvantages. It is not a programming language, which means that learning it will not necessarily help you to learn other programming languages. Batch. Batch is basically what you use when you type code into your Windows command prompt. It is more a scripting language than a programming language, but it can be used as both. Advantages. You have way more control over your Windows OS by knowing Batch. You can look super cool, like hackers in movies, by coding with it. It can help you get a job in system administration and or IT. Since you can program with it, it can help you learn other programming languages and scripting languages. Disadvantages. It is not beginner friendly. It has a lot of messed up syntax that can easily influence you when you try to learn other programming languages. You're giving yourself a lot of power over your PC by learning Batch, and can easily, by executing the wrong commands, erase your entire hard drive or lock you out of your system. Bash. Bash, a lot like Batch, is a programming language used in most Linux terminals. It, just like Batch, can be used as a scripting and programming language. Here are the advantages. You can get a job in system administration by knowing Bash. You can take your first steps to becoming a hacker. You can have a lot of control over your Linux operating system. Since you can program with it, it can help you learn other programming and scripting languages. By learning it, you can become a power user, making your daily activities on your computer 10 times faster. Of course, nothing is perfectly balanced without a downside. By getting a lot of control over your OS by using this, you can very easily accidentally erase your entire system or mess it up completely. This comes from my own personal experience. It is not beginner friendly. It is mostly a scripting language, so programming with it will not always give you the desired results. And that is all in terms of programming languages for today. Just remember that all of this comes from my personal experience and opinions. But feel free to leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all have a clearer idea of what programming language you want to learn next. And see you all in the next video.